So the context for making you read these pieces today is to get us to the next stage of this arc of the class, right? Which is we started by talking about gender as performance, gender as structure, gender as like an institutional norm. Um, you're looking so worried. Um, and then yesterday we were like trying to complicate that by saying, well, is gender just gender? What about the other intersections that complicate gender? How do we think about, different kinds of identities that make it different? And then tomorrow we're going to talk about, I'm just previewing this. Tomorrow we're going to talk about how identity as a concept is quite limiting. But before we get to that, I want to talk today about how identity categories are useful or can be useful for law and can be useful for gender. And as you can tell, like, I told you the first day of class, like you can't be entirely convinced about concepts. That's not the nature of this class. You're trying to sit with the discomfort of actually not fully knowing some things. But I'm hoping the readings that you did today started to get you thinking about when is gender helpful as a legal category. And I think the Blase reading, which is an idea that I'm working through right now, is to think about when social categories and legal categories are not set and they're in flux. And they're in flux differently in different contexts, they're in flux differently in different environments. What happens to them? How do you navigate things that are not actually clear categories? And when I say clear categories, I mean clear categories of identity and clear categories of harm. And when those two intersect, how do we think about the dismissal that happens, right? And so a common question I get is that isn't this just microaggressions and sort of the and I'm actually not that committed to distinguishing this from microaggressions. I'm much more interested in the larger theoretical idea that the difference is microaggression at the core is about a settled category. So usually microaggressions are, aggressions about a category that's settled, like race or class or gender or caste, right? But where the act itself does not rise to the level of being discrimination, right? So it's like discrimination light. The thing I'm more interested in is when even if something is macro, even if someone is like actively contesting your identity or aggressive about it, if the category doesn't exist, it is not even counted as aggression because there are no ways to understand it. So it's an epistemological understanding of when you don't have the words for something, what happens. So is harm alone enough? And yesterday we started to get into this conversation, which is it enough if you just feel the harm? And then what about power? Like, what if I'm someone I'm teaching a class and I'm the professor, I'm going to be grading your exams, I have power, and then someone makes a slip about my pronouns, right? And then I go after them and I'm like, I cannot believe you did this about my identity. That's a totally different context, right? Because power is never absent, so power is always present. That's a totally different concept, and I wouldn't say that's blasé, right? Like, that's actually me enforcing power in a classic governance feminist way against someone else. But it could be blasé if a colleague of mine that is in a society where they know that this is going to cause harm to me, but they don't think it's that important. They think it's a preference. They think, oh, it's so cool that they're trying to play with identity, right? And this is like after 6 years after I've used these pronouns, and you give them a long way of thinking about it. If they use my pronouns wrong, then I actually think there is something really interesting about that. It's a similar way to which my when I first moved to the US, my name would always get butchered, and people would like sort of make it about them when they butchered my name. They'd be like, "Oh, I really can't say this. Is it like Sue? Is it Sweet? Can I call you Sweet?" And you're like, "Stop talking. Like, just don't call me, right? Like, call me Sue, right? Like, what? Or just don't call me. Just call me Bala. Like, that's easier, right?" And they would not do that now because they know that doing that to like immigrants is problematic at some cultural level. They have that understanding. But 20 years ago, 25 years ago, they didn't have that cultural understanding. So I'm interested in, like, before the social movement takes over or the legal movement takes over, what happens to categories that have not yet come to fruition, right? Like, and it's the piece that you read is the start of the project. Like, I'm sort of much deeper in because now it's much more about non-binary navigation and what it means. But the piece that you read was the first time that I was dealing with it, where I was thinking about neurodivergence along with non-binary identity, along with Muslim Americans in the legal workforce. And I was interested in how different kinds of identities get treated as not that important or doesn't rise to the level of being problematic. Um, and I was trying to like make an intervention to the discrimination jurisprudence that is so tied to categories and is so tied to harm that is visible or navigable, etc. Um, and trying to get them to think about what happens when you can just shrug off a harm because you also don't think it is a harm, right? So the difference is I might lose sleep over it, but the other person doesn't even, it doesn't even rise to the level of them thinking it's important enough to acknowledge. Um, and so that's the idea. That I mean, I sort of um, I'm pretty I'm sort of curious about what it does to different people when they take it away. So yeah, yeah.
I have a slight question. What is the difference between a blase thing and dog whistling? Is it just intent? Yes.
It's the lack of intent. Like, yeah.
No,
So
dog whistling is there is clear intent.
yeah, and I think it's like complete lack of intent. Like, and I think it's not just lack of intent. Like, I think it's not even a real act. It's that one person is thinking about this. Like, I have students who said I would be referred to by a wrong pronoun. I will freeze in class. I can't talk, right? But I move away from it, and the other person doesn't even know that they've done something. So I'm interested in that. I'm interested in like what happens when the other person does not even think this is a thing, and this happens a lot when um, it it's like when people can shrug it off or laugh it off, and then I'm working with the next concept that I'm working with is like self-blase, where then you say, well, I don't want to do the mental work of dealing with this. I'm going to de-escalate and just say, use whatever pronouns you want, do whatever you need. I'm not going to handle this. And that's a kind of mental labor and protection you offer yourself. Um, which is sort of not what you would do to a dog whistle, right? Like, because in that scenario, it's an act, it's an intentional act, and your response is, you did this terrible thing to me, and there is, and or not just a terrible thing, like there's words for it, I think, or there's intention for it.
Yeah, mostly. But
Yeah.
like the dog whistle is mostly just like use of specific words in specific ways.
Right.
That can only be understood by like a particular group.
Right, but they're also used within the context of known harm by the person that's using it, right?
So there is a known harm and there's
both. Yeah, right. Because I mean, actually, the good example for this is the use of the N word in the U.S. context for like hate speech and like what it means for people to use it as an act of First Amendment, right? Like on clear grounds that I should be allowed to use what it is because I'm teaching them what laws were actually done. And you're like, an entire social movement has asked for this to not be used as a word, and you're doing this because you know it is. You're doing this under constitutional protections, knowing that it is harming a specific person, right? And you can say, well, they should not be harmed because the world outside is terrible. They're going to have to deal with this anyway. I am training them. This is actual transcript. I'm training them for it, so they have to be able to go out and deal with it. And I would argue that that's not blasé. That's incredibly that's sort of, there's an intention to harm, knowing that it would be read a certain way. Are there other like questions about the concept before? Yeah.
So I wanted to understand like which category would, so let's say the concept of creamy layer has come into our jurisprudence.
Yeah.
It has become a legal category for certain extent.
And for certain people,
and
yeah.
For certain people, it may actually mean that it may harm them, even like making this category. So, how would it be seen as a blasé discrimination by the code itself?
I would say it's not. That's my point. Anything that has already been categorized, right? Like misuse. I think that's more accidental, right? Like that's like a classic case of unintended consequences of a thing that you think is supposed to do something good, and it's like the unintended consequences that follow are often because that you haven't thought through the social ramifications of how the law in the books versus or how the law in categories versus the law in action is to do. This is much more closer to gaslighting in a sense, right? Like when someone says something, and then you really wonder whether, and I have to share that, like, even as I write this book, I'm like, is this really a thing? Like, am I writing something that's like a real issue? Like, am I just being an academic? Kranti, I'm going to use this to the class. Right? But it's like, is it just an intellectual exercise? Am I just thinking about it? And I've had to actually journal and articulate the harm for myself in being able to ground it and having to talk to other humans that have actually also had the same kind of harm and the same sense of self-blasing or self-ramifying, um, to connect it to being the truth. And I think a lot about this. It's like feminist scholars or like queer scholars. Why are we so obsessed with the truth that is generalizable to majority powerful people? Like, why are we always thinking about what is true in the eyes of others when there's a good chance my experience is sort of personal, right? Like, this is what the critical race theorists teach you about what is true or what is possible. And so that's, so it ties into that conversation too. I know you had your hand up.
No, can we really see certain categorizations are completely unintentional?
So you think I'm being generous by saying it's completely there's intention everywhere?
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, I think if I go to my village in Tamil Nadu and someone says she, her, like, I don't know, like, sort of imagines a certain version of heteropatriarchy for me, there is an intention to harm.
With regards to legal categorizations, Professor.
Oh, so whether it can, no, and I think that's what I'm struggling with, which is like, at the most meta level, do I even want it to have a legal category, or do I want it to be expansive enough that facts then determine at different levels of, jurisprudence, I mean, not jurisprudence, but different levels of, like, contestation, what it means to have had a blase act. You're right. I actually don't. I think the minute you make it a legal category, it stops being blase. But I think of it more, it's not just for this movement. I'm thinking of it more as a, what happens before a right gets crystallized, right? Like, what do we do to that moment just before, right? The same thing that's happening to genderqueer people now happened to cis gay people 50 years ago, right? Like, it happened to, in the US, like, the civil rights jurisprudence has very similar logics of what it means to call someone something. But the minute the right gets crystallized, then it's not blase anymore. Intention is assumed, even if it's not trickled down to you. So it's much more the prefiguration, what happens just before it happens. Yeah.
More of like, yeah, I mean, like the process that goes before categorizing some certain things, so like blase, and considering blase or not, and like what are to be read into this specific right and what are not to be read into this specific set, right? So there are intentional categorizations of certain things to be read into and certain things not to be read into.
Yeah.
I think that's a conscious choice that's been made, and to make law look more objective so that it's easier for categorization of certain things. So I think there's always intentionality that's being there when certain things are
By the law.
legal, by the law.
Yes, I think there is always intentionality, and it follows social intentionality.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the reason I'm focusing at the individual level and the interactional level is because right now there's, like, I mean, the context is also very American, but it's like, I'm really interested in, like, where there's a social flux of the category and there's legal flux, right? Because in some cases, like some states like California, for example, like, sort of have legal recognition of a genderqueer category, and other states absolutely don't. In fact, it is illegal to have it. And there's an executive order right now, whose constitutionality we don't know, that makes it flexible in a way that actually, until it's contested in court, we're not going to know whether it's legal or illegal. So theoretically, it's sort of an interesting time to pay attention to what happens. How do people respond to these categories when it's not set in law or social code? But I agree with you. The law itself is always intentional, and it's always delayed to what social acceptability or category is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we were trying to look at examples that were not gender or caste related
Yes.
specifically. So class, I think, is what we landed on. So two separate situations. You go in a chappal or shorts to a club where admission is restricted based on footwear or full clothes or whatever. Or you walk into Macy's or whatever is the equivalent fancy shop where the snooty shopkeeper basically makes you leave. So is either one, both, any of these under blase?
If they reserve the right to entry, then it is just them doing a thing they're allowed to do because it's a private establishment.
But especially the experience of someone like I know that I may not be allowed. Know I'm familiar with this background. I go versus somebody who doesn't know, who just hasn't had the access. Their experience of being turned away because of not wearing shoes is going to be very different from my experience of.
So that's like your individual
The
class.
feeling discriminated is going to remain in their case.
Thinking Pretty Woman.
Thank you for bringing pop culture back into this scene.
No, I mean that is very much the
Yeah,
thing,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
You do
yeah.
have entry.
You
But
have
you are
entry,
not-
but you're not restricted. And I think part of like the reason I think class complicates all of this. But I think the reason class complicates it in a hard way is because you are not like there isn't an assumption of entry at the is this my main identity and do I feel harm in being turned away?
Right. If I'm approaching this space for the first time, if this is I'm new to the city or I'm from a small town, or definitely the hesitation is there in even approaching the place.
And then whether I get turned away, yeah, I see that. But I think for me the other part of blase that helps is if I told other people, would they think that's a harm? Is there enough viable legibility to other people? And I think that's where the point of community comes in, the fact of who you share with comes in, right? Like if you told other people who also were turned away, then they'd be like, that place is awful. It's like so classes. Let's not do that. But if so pervasive and who thinks they have the right to talk about your at a particular foundational point of your life where you don't think that's part of your identity, then that just has a real impact on whether you think weight is a real discriminatory category or not. Right. So, in the same way, class could also be a category where it depends on where you started from and whether you thought this discrimination was something that would hurt you or not. And the question is whether the other person thinks they are doing an intentional act of dismissing you. And there isn't a generalizable way of doing that, because I would argue class discrimination is pretty settled. We discriminate on class all the time, and we think that is we think it's a hierarchy worth preserving in late capitalism. But I think part of the gender, for me, the distinction with gender queerness is people don't even think gender queerness is a category. So it's not that they think, oh, you're category X, so you're not allowed. They don't even think it is a category.
Okay. Then fatness being another example.
Yeah.
Two scenarios. I'm not offered an extended seat belt on an airplane.
Yeah.
Versus I cannot get on the roller coaster simply because the size does not accommodate. So in one case, we are very clear that, oh, come on, you should provide for an extra seat belt.
Or because it's choice.
We do not have, because it's transport, like, hello.
Yeah.
But in another case, maybe this is only a avenue I have for experiencing adrenaline rush.
Wait, and you think it's not discriminatory in the other case? I think it's discriminatory in both cases.
Oh, is actively discriminatory structurally that they have not made larger seats or some seats of different
Or
sizes?
require you to buy two whatever seats or
But that
whatever.
might not be possible on a roller coaster, because if you make seats that bigger, then it's unsafe for the
That's a-
normal sized people in that sense.
I don't think normal is the word to use.
Yeah.
That's why, like, we don't need to normalize things.
I always end up at that word, but but
Averages.
I think, the core of the discussion we were having, the difference was that because travel is considered essential, is that people
Yeah.
recognize the discrimination, but not in the roller coaster.
Right.
Because it's like it's a choice, it's for fun, so it's not discriminatory.
Which is
If you
true.
can't have fun, it's fun.
Or like there are other ways you can have fun. Do whatever other people who are plus size do. Eat. Yeah.
I think that's
Great
a very
contributions,
good
Professor.
As a fat person.
I think there's also so I think those two things are distinguished because of the structural element of it. But I'm more interested in the interaction. It's whether the flight attendant feels bad about saying they don't have an extra seat versus the person who's manning the roller coaster who's just like, "Nahi, you can't go. Sign nahi padaya, don't come." Right? Like just who can settle back onto the category of safety, right? Or whatever. Like, I mean, for me, fatness and health are so, like, BMI is like such a incredibly, global, it's white supremacist.
Yeah,
Is that what you said?
racist.
Yeah, it's so racist, right? Like, it's, or any, all the body metrics that are normal, to use your word, in the US context, right, are not based on the South Asian body, right? So they require you to do multiple extra check-ins, and it's for health. They're like, you are, I think I'm like borderline obese or something, right? Like, which is hilarious to me. But like, it's also explained that this is a thing to work on, and all answers to everything is lose 20 pounds. And in the I have to say, like, in this, like, at the other thing we're on the precipice of is Ozempic, right? Like, so in the precipice of one more thing about um weight enhancing, like, sorry, weight reducing drugs. It's going to be really interesting. I think this new wave of medical intervention is going to do the same thing to our understandings of bodies, or full bodies, as the Prozac wave did 20 years ago to neurodivergence. So I think we're on the precipice of, like, these categories not being settled, but also there's an assumption that it is for the greater good that we are doing this, right? It's like, and so that's slightly different from something that is so blatantly expendable that you don't even have to raise it to the level of an interaction.
Sorry, I was just thinking about what you were saying, because we were tying up bodies in relation to transness and fatness.
Yeah.
Somebody was just talking about it online a couple of days ago, the fact that they're a therapist who is seeing lots of patients coming in who've been prescribed Ozempic and weight loss medication.
Yeah.
And the distinction between the ease with which weight loss medication is prescribed, which may have lasting side effects, which may require recurrent use, yada, understudied, not enough long-term trial, all of those things, versus the number of hoops you need to jump through if you want to access trans-affirming medical care, right? They're both altering your body in very fundamental ways.
Right.
But there is an imagination of what is absolutely normal alteration that obviously everybody must want.
Right.
It's for your needs. And
It is for your knees. Like, that knees jagda is like the most pervasive one.
I'm saying it as someone with a broken knee, I get that extra. And versus, like, the number of time you have to go to a therapist, you have to be certified, you need to be certain that this is something you want to do, yada, yada.
And those therapist consultations are constantly completely not blasé, by the way, because they're very actively non-blasé. They're like, are you sure you want to go on tea? Like, do you know this is the impact? Like, they want you to make, which is not something they will do when they give you, I don't know, like, after a tooth appointment, they will ask you if you want a Valium. Right? Like, the way in which medicine gets prescribed is also an interesting.
I mean, you have the entire opioid crisis.
Right, which is a result of when something is seen as choice versus not. Alia, 1 second. I just want to make one more point about this. The connection to fatness and transness also, I think, is another extension to that is how, since we're in a gender class, how beauty affirming surgeries are treated, right? So if you think of the meta micro complex of, like, cosmetic surgery and plastic surgery that exists, right, for all sorts of things, it is not seen as needed to be regulated in quite the same way, even though it is a change, even though it's a choice. Like, you don't have to go through the same loopholes of therapy. You don't have to go through the same loopholes of engagement. It is seen as your choice. That's the thing you want to do, because you're reaffirming a ideal type of what you want to look like. That gender affirming body care is seen as not in the state's interest to touch, right? Because it feeds capital, and a lot of it is private funding, right? Like, there's you can argue why that is the case, but I think it's a helpful academic distinction between why that is seen as choice that should be affirmed versus why trans choice making is definitely you being in the throes of political euphoria that you're confused about, that you cannot possibly know. I'm like, why don't we tell people who are getting, I mean, and I say this as someone who's, like, completely affirming of all care that people need to feel in their bodies, right? Like, this is not judgment on any of these things. But I would really like it if, like, very rich people who are trying to get cosmetic surgeries to, like, make their nose just so, are also told of the long-term implications of what that is going to do, in the same way that people who are trying to access testosterone, right, like, or like HRT in any dimension, are told what it means to have that change.
I would like to add on to the Manukya's example.
Yeah.
Not only the weight we consider more than what actually we should have, but the opposite also happens many times. The weight below 55 kgs, persons are not allowed to sit in the roller coaster. Yeah.
What are these roller coasters that you guys are doing? Where is that? First of all, I've never been allowed to a roller coaster because of my height. But where are these roller coasters, and what are these entirely dismissive, perfect body institutions that they're asking for?
There is a board which specifies the weight criteria before
Where you go on? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an actual thing.
So where is this? First of all, where is there a place with a roller coaster here?
Wonderland.
Wonderworld?
Amusement park.
Wow.
Yeah, I think those restrictions are really interesting, but I don't think they're blasé in the same way, because that means there's real intention there. You're putting up a board and saying this has got to be what you do, or this has got to be what you don't do, and this is the reason why you're doing it. It's a little bit different than I think, like, someone laughing by saying, yeah, I'm going to make a joke about you that's slightly Islamophobic, but I don't mean that, right? Like, just to laugh it off, to the point where you yourself say, like, maybe you were making a joke and it wasn't real. So I think that's, like, sort of the affective loop that I'm thinking of as blasé.
Are you calling that a microaggression?
That is a microaggression, because I think in this case, religion is like a secured, understood, established category. Yeah.
Professor, adding on to what you were saying earlier about transness and plastic surgery in specific, I've had a friend abroad while they were specifically searching out for facial feminization surgery.
Yeah.
Right? For that in specific, they were constantly told, there's a number of people who regret their transition. This constant mindset that is
Totally.
in conservative places. But when you go for a face plastic surgery,
You're like, you'll feel so good. You should get a
you
mom.
should definitely do it. People are going to start seeing you differently. Marriage prospects are starting. They're both permanent changes. Both permanent changes to the same face.
Yes. One is gender affirming in a way that society thinks is good,
Yeah.
and the other is something that threatens cis-het people's versions of their own bodies. Like, it's really what the threat is, right? Actually, if you think about it, blaseness, like, at the one level, is without intention, but it's rooted in threat, right? If I told you when people are like, my brain doesn't work like that, my favorite excuse for you not using they them pronouns, and I'll always say, okay, like, if I changed my name, like, let's assume I got married at 21 to a cishet man, right? Like, and I changed my name to something else. Would you have had this much trouble? No, you knew me as Sweta Balakrishnan, or like B Sweta, as everybody here has called me. But if I change my name, we do this all the time. We change people's names and we affirm them. And in fact, when we slip, we're like, so sorry, you're Mrs. Sharma now, no? Like, there's like such a commitment to this, right? And it's like jovial. So it's like people are capable of changing, right? So this idea that this is not something I can do, or that language is too hard, I find that really hard to accept, because I don't think that's true. I think we change language all the time. Like, so then I have to understand that it's actually political correctness. You actually think this is some cool wave woke thing that you're doing, and tomorrow is going to be something else. I don't want to deal with this, right? And if that's it, then the pushback is, well, do you know how much work goes into needing to affirm your gender that isn't on the binary? It is so much work. So if someone is doing it, even if they're only doing it for 3 months, like, don't you think you should affirm them on their terms, because it's not very fun for them to do? And I think that's the slip, which is sort of interesting to me in the gender
Another
context.
example, when you're talking about they them pronouns specifically, one of the arguments I see, at least back in school, was like, oh, you don't really use singular they them pronouns, and to see them, like the fact that you can't use singular terms next to they them pronouns, and you're like,
Grammatically incoherent.
yes, grammatically.
Which gets used in law school all the time.
And also, because like this is example that I use to at least tell my friends, if somebody has lost a bottle, would be like, oh, his one, her
Exactly,
bottle.
exactly. You would say exactly. I'm like, if you don't know someone's gender and they haven't yet come, and you're saying, "Well, I'm waiting for them to come," that's not bad language, right? We do it all the time. Exactly, exactly. I was trying to set an exam once, and I was, I was trying to center it around a genderqueer protagonist, like the fact pattern. And someone said, "Oh, that's going to be really confusing. They're not going to know what the data is. You want to make sure you don't increase the anxiety of the students. You want to make sure it's as direct as possible." And I was like, "Do you really think that of all the things that produce anxiety for students in the classroom, me using them pronouns on or the? I mean, I get it. Like it's and the idea is that it's confusing, right? Or it's ill clarifying, and it all goes back to the fact that people love categorizing. This is where Ridgway's background frameworks helps, right? Everyone loves putting you in a box. And if they can't put you in a box, they're nervous about what that says about them. And so then there's a resistance to the not putting in the box. And their response to it often is to not deal with it. So blaseness, I hope, gets at the start of that non-dealing, of just like, this is not a thing. Yeah.
Okay, I want to sort of move this in a different direction. I understand that you use the word blase for a specific reason, but do you think that there can be a positive way to use blaseness?
And that's my hope. So the last chapter of the book is like trying to think of like the most meta blase, which is when it's not even an issue. Like we're all so like I have god kids that are in like middle like in that are like between 7 to 9, right? And when I told them my pronouns, they're like, okay, great, and they just were blasé about it. They were like so commonplace about it. It just slid into their vocabulary. It became what they did. They moved on. I think of that as like as the most meta blase possibility that could be there. And the other side of it was sort of what we were talking about in terms of the law recognizing it. If that becomes what happens, then it's not at all blase because it's like an active because the minute something gets recognized, it's not blase. And I think that when that happens, there'll be another category. Like we're not, as humans, we are committed to hierarchy. So if this is not the thing that we're doing terrible things to, we'll find something else to do terrible things to, right? Like there's always going to be there'll always be something else that is not socially or legally recognized that we're going to have to contend with. And I hope that so the framework for me is much more theoretically important for that category before it becomes recognized. Not so much just about gender queerness. Yeah.
So many thoughts.
How do we look at it from this? Because especially because you're talking about usefulness of blaseness, right? Where does disrespect come in? Because it's different from discrimination. For it to be, it's disrespect. It's not harm. But
I like that, yeah. Because then it invokes dignity
yes,
into it rather than
to your questions of like and obviously the person is not really sure as to what exactly happened.
respect looks like.
Yeah.
I think all of this, right? Discrimination, disrespect, microaggression, dog whistle, all of this requires some amount of attention to the category by the other person. Right. So I guess the variations I think of is if it's in a community where everyone knows that this is what affirms someone and they choose not to do it because they don't think it's a real category. So it's disbelief, not disagreement. Then that disrespect, that I think is disrespect, right? But if you're in a context where they have no context for what it is you're talking about, and you're sort of feeling harm and hurt, but it's not because the other person like even can understand the words. Like my mother doesn't use they them pronouns for me, right? But she also calls me her son and like calls me like king of the world, right? Like there's like ways in which she affirms my identity without using pronouns. So I don't know if that is disrespect, but I think part of it is my agency. Who am I inviting in and saying what you're doing is not harmful to me, and whether I have a choice? I think it is disrespect when someone says this is not a thing, which also happens, right? When people say, "Is this some new wave you've caught onto? I thought only young people were doing this," right? Like that is disrespect in a sense. but I think disrespect helps us get to a non-discrimination space, but I'm not sure. I'll have to think more about how that implicates or complicates intention. And I'm not quite sure about it.
Professor, I think it's coming out of a personal experience that I mean, not mine, that I
Yeah.
observed. I mean, people who, I mean, certain communities who do not speak Hindi, but their languages which are do not identify or
Not so
binarize
gendered.
gender as such, and when they start speaking Hindi, it's mostly the masculine way or addressing that comes out
Yeah.
when they're speaking. So how do
Yeah,
we
my-
see bless in those contexts when the gender is not understood in their vernacular
But they-
as
but-
such as a binary?
So they come from language context where if I'm understanding your hypo right, so the language context they come from does not have gender in the language. It only has a unigender language.
Yeah.
And they are speaking to somebody for whom in a language where everything is gendered, like
Yeah.
Spanish or Hindi or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And so it's whether their lack of this defines my entire childhood of speaking Hindi. Right? Like as a Madrasi, like I definitely spoke it like this.
No, but Tamil is gendered language. If I'm assuming.
Yeah, but I didn't really speak much. I didn't speak anything. I felt like I was just shy of all, like I was scared of playing with all language in a sense. Or maybe I wasn't. I don't know. Yeah, but Tamil is gendered. But Tamil is also, you can also use Tamil agendered, right? You can say Ava, Iva, like you can use, there are ways to agender Tamil that don't exist in Hindi. And also Tamil doesn't gender all its,
All nouns.
I don't think it genders its whole
No, at least Telugu genders everything is familiar.
Yeah, but that comes from the Sanskrit root. Tamil is a Dravidian root that doesn't do that.
Okay.
Like, so the Tamil genders the people, but it doesn't gender the nouns and the verbs. So it's actually not, it wasn't coming from I'm making it sound like I had some great grammatical brain. I didn't. But I'm just saying, I just started it. When I started speaking Hindi, it didn't occur to me that like whatever Brahmaputra is a male river and something else is a female. Like that, I just it blew my mind. I was like, what do you mean it's a river, right? Like, but the fact that everything is and Spanish is like this, everything is gendered. Yeah, array, all of them. There's just but it comes from the root of gendering words and verbs that was completely alien to me at the time. But I also didn't think I was slipping on language when I was using those interchangeably, right? But actually, that was the other blase. I was made fun of a lot because I was like one of the few people that didn't speak Hindi fluently, and it was seen as a sign of being a Madrasi, like which I claim now is a deep identity, but like when I was a kid, like was a source of like, am I supposed to feel bad about this? Like I actually don't know. Yeah. And I think that is why it's one of my primary identities now, because I'm like, are you joking? Like this has always dismissed me as not important. So I'm going to reinvest in this identity as an older person. But I'm going away off track. Your question was if the person slips on pronouns because of lack of language, is it blase? Yeah. Right?
My question is more of like the primary vernacular does not have the distinctions of binary language, but when only a singular unigender addressing as such, and when they
use a different language, they use the masculine language. And I think that is just a function of like, a generous reading would be that it's a function of like non-closeness to the language, right? Or like not being able to think in another language, or like, or unless this person is like onto a trans woman and actively is using this because they're trying to deny the affirming position of the person, which again happens a lot, right? But in which case it wouldn't be blase, like it, right? It would be like it would be active harm. But I'm not sure. I think that I struggle with this idea of like different language. I struggle with this idea of thinking in different languages, because I think you're right. I think there are slips that happen viably, not because you're trying to change the gender, but because you actually are just speaking and it's not a thing that comes up for you as even relevant. And I've had like older Spanish speaking, first language Spanish speaking people who will address me as Ella, but then like look at me and be like, L, like sort of not know what to use and then not know how to transpose the verbs after, not because they're trying to misgender me, but because it's like changing the praxis is hard. And that's why the Latinx movement has like been relevant. I guess I'm saying I don't know the answer to it simply because it depends on the context of what the interaction is coming from. What were other examples? I've just like gone off. Yeah.
So one thing that I noticed is that a lot of the older people, they justify being ignorant of someone's pronouns or misgendering someone by using the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So which basically talks that as so only is it's basically a pyramid structure, and the base talks about the physiological needs, and only as you keep progressing and you reach that self actualization point can you like truly know yourself. So in the Indian context, in the 11th grade, I was asking my psychology teacher that a lot of these, because I was just starting to read about a lot of movements that were happening. So she told me that in the Indian context, people don't really respect someone's pronouns because they haven't reached the self-actualization points because of the poverty that exists in India. However, I disagree with that because that's no reason that
I actually there's some usefulness. I think the genderqueer movement is such an elite caste. Is like upper class movement. I mean, I don't think it's a movement. And the people who can even affirm it, right, come with other kinds of privilege to even know that that's an identity that they want to have affirmed for them, right? Like there's a reason why I would never get an X marker, even if it was available in the Indian context, right? Because I think the trans histories in this country have been distinctly different and have been casted and violent in ways that I actually feel really complicated stakes to claim with, right? But I think the idea that so I think it's both true, which is why when we started this class, I said that these are my pronouns, but if you don't use them, I don't care, right? Like I don't think it works in the same way here, or it doesn't work if someone like because I think you're starting from a point of privilege if you can even ask for that in some context. But I think that's not always true. Like sometimes you can be with very elite people who will understand, to use your word, self-actualization on other terms, but not on the terms that challenge their gender binary. So it sort of has a class component to it, I think, which is worth heeding. Yeah.
I wrote like some months back, I think Anandita read that. Because I come from Jharkhand, Bihar, and the way I speak Hindi, and I deliberately made a choice to.
They would always ask me if I was from UP because I would say hum all the time because I was so terrified of using pronouns. No, I was so terrified. I was just like, we, the royal we are doing this thing.
So hum karte hain, hum
Yeah,
karte hain,
yeah,
but
yeah.
It does not really want me to kind of gender me. I don't want to put
Yeah,
myself in
yeah.
a box, which is okay. I had that option to train myself when I came out here.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
could have talked like in a regular, more a polished way of Hindi by using men, right? But I felt that my gender was getting affirmed in the way
Yeah.
when I'm speaking hum. And I wrote that, and
But not the Lucknowi type, not the of the.
but it's like more to come with Bihar specific kind of in
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Which is possibility of opening up that space that gender queerness can also happen in vernacular language. It has existed in that. And
So a lot of religious texts think about, I mean, not to associate an individual with spiritual assumptions of God, right? But there are ways in which there are radical texts that say we shouldn't, in a lot of spiritual traditions, like refer to God as gendered or like spirit as gendered or like understands it. And I think I've always looked at that and been like, that's interesting because it then opens up for a public that would otherwise not have access to queer theory, a way of thinking about gender is truly irrelevant. Although I guess they could read that as well. This is irrelevant. I'm thinking of like specific, again, the Islamic legal tradition of like not using gender ever in like readings of old texts. And I'm like, oh, maybe that'll like open up a way of like queer reading of text, but maybe that's not what.
I was just thinking, taking off from that, the hum karke baat karna, that, the blase, this thing you were speaking of in terms of your god kids being like, I was thinking about, say, Falguni Pathak, and I was thinking,
Totally, yeah.
I was thinking about so much queerness that just exists by
Existed.
existing, that doesn't.
Does everyone know who Falguni Pathak is?
Yeah. But just the idea that
That was the first queer person I saw on screen.
but just that I've always been curious about, for instance, we have all of these very large trappings of language, and partially why I gave up on the pronouns project in relation to myself was also a friend I told you who doesn't have very much English, which was possibly the most affirming moment I've had with anybody in life. after some years of knowing me, looked at me. There's someone who's dropped out of school in 6th grade, no English really, has picked up English in communication with me and a couple of other people. So he says, "You're a little bit outside woman, no?" And it was
The most affirming thing, yeah.
because I knew that he got it. He didn't have the language
Right,
for it,
right.
but he got it. It was
Right.
like, people who are feminist without knowing the language of feminism.
Right.
So, like, that way, I feel like the possibilities of the uncategorized are it's such a fertile
Yeah.
space.
And I think that's why I was hoping reading it alongside the idea of like how do we name things in feminism was helpful in terms of like what do you do without language, and also who's speaking on behalf of whom. Asking for your pronouns to be affirmed is also such an elite thing in certain contexts, right? Like it's like saying, oh, I know this language, the language is cooler than yours, I'm more advanced, and because I'm more advanced I need you to do X or Y. Like it's such a hierarchical ask in some contexts. Like I would argue that it isn't a hierarchical ask in an elite institution in California, like where they, if someone's making me give a talk on diversity and trying to like attract, like, bless you, um, trying to attract like a certain, they're trying to posture a certain version of like radical possibility, and they're using my pronouns wrong. That's a very different thing than being here and me being upset with my perima because she didn't say my pronouns right. Like I'm just like, this is not where I'm going. This is not where I can ask for that. Other example, yeah.
Slightly off topic, more going to language.
Yeah.
Like some of the speakers are Telugu here, I presume. The way you can say about that bottle, Adikadundi, you can say about a woman.
That's right.
So,
Oh, that's right. That's like,
I think the language provides for so much objectification of women, or not just objectification, even like just lack of agency, because things and women, and with the exception of maybe sun, moon is actually surprisingly, depending on the word, referred to both as male and female. Except some celestial bodies, everything is female. The book, and it's so easy to use the same language for girls, for women, and take away the agency. Happens. The language provides for it in ways that are impossible in English or French or anything else that come across. Hindi here even.
That's fascinating.
that's so interesting because other in
Others who
Tamil,
speak Telugu, can you?
Could you repeat that sentence again?
Adakadundi. Dini ikkada pedadam. What is
right,
this?
right.
Yeah.
But it's only interesting because in Tamil, other is actively casteist.
Oh, Adi just means things.
I know, but other gets used in a casteist way, right? Other is to take away agency,
That's just very common.
right? But I'm saying the idea of what sits close to, the things you ask for might be things that have histories of violence and like. So I'm agreeing with you. I'm just saying in different languages, those things can be important because, like, I remember my dad saying, "So you want they in Tamil is other, like, so is that how? Tell me how that works. Like, do you want to be a thing?" And I was like, but think about when thing gets used, right? I actually am like, I don't want gender to be ascribed to me. He's like, I understand it, but like, what would you say in this context, right? Like trying to do the mental gymnastics in other languages has a different violence. Shivani, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah. Like I have two responses. One is like what Prerna was sharing regarding hum, but like in Hindi, the plural is also gendered. Like if I take an example of saying plural in like chhatra, which is like plural for female students, तो हम बोले we'll say कि हम standard XYZ की छात्राएं आपको ये प्रस्तुत कर रही हैं. So like I find it
That's so
very
interesting.
patriarchal that even the like privileged queer circles also, when we say that okay in Hindi we use plural as a gender neutral pronoun, it's mostly the male pronoun which is considered to be gender neutral. Is like my
But you couldn't do kar rahe hain?
yeah, so no, that's what I'm saying. Because like I have mostly learned Hindi in a very grammatical way.
So in grammatical Hindi, the plurals are also gendered.
That's what people are writing about. That's the grammatical violence that happens.
Right.
Why is it
And that's
that-
also very Sanskritized.
So that's what my question is, that why is it that we are considering the male plural as the gender neutral plural that can be used rather than
It always has been, but I think the offering here is that there's a needing to do it differently. Right? Because all language is male skewed until it's female skewed to do hierarchy. Like most of language is male skewed, right? Like history, the word is male skewed.
but isn't if we're using a male centered plural pronoun, is that we're
But you don't have to use a male centered pronoun, right?
but that is how the popular use happens, is what like my reflection is it.
Huh.
That then in some ways we're just saying that okay, this is the most convenient plural that we're using, and we're just accepting the male plural pronoun in that context.
So interestingly, where I got an inspiration to write that is that there's an Australian like academic who teaches Hindi in Australia, and they're not like a Hindi speaker, but they're just interested in language, and they are teaching Australians to speak in Hindi and whatever. And the piece was coming from this place where non-binary speakers in the class, when they're having to introduce themselves, how exactly do we, what do we choose, right? And then someone kind of makes that similar point that you're making, that isn't that grammatically incorrect, right? हम छात्र हैं, हम बैठे हैं. It should not be like there is a the semantically it has to be correct, grammatically it has to be correct. So that the person who is doing this plan says that how much of it has to be, because again it is also very sanitized way of speaking, and which is something that if we really go to Hindi, right, it is a mode of communication which if you look at a place like Bihar for that matter, where every 10 kilometers the way you speak Hindi or the version of it keeps on
intonation
changing.
changes,
Language
yeah.
itself keeps changing, right? Both my parents, right? One speaks Bhojpuri, the other speaks Magadhi, right? They talk in their own respective languages, but they're able to understand each other. So insisting on the grammatical correctness of it does that kind of violence, which
No, I'm not insisting on the grammatical correctness, and I'm not sure. So maybe you can reflect on it. That even when in Bihari dialects, a group of only females are referred to, is it that a female pronoun is used? Because from my experience, what I've noticed is that when we are considering it to be neutral, is that when a male pronoun is being used, and to point out to an exclusively female group is only when a female pronoun is used.
Mixed gender
So,
would be
like, male is the.
I feel like I don't know enough Hindi to make this connection. I'm like struggling. I'm struggling with what the combined plural pronoun
For
is.
example, in law, we say men includes women in a lot of definitions. It's similar to that. That when we're referring to a general group of mixed genders, we're using.
No, I get that, but that's the starting of language. It isn't the point that Prerna's making that you can have queer like responses or extensions into
I'm
it.
just trying to like instigate this thinking that why.
But even the basis of, I think that we're all in agreement that the basis of all language is patriarchal and violent and meant to.
And especially because it's like an ongoing project right now
Hmm.
around finding
The right most affirming
vocabulary
way.
in the language where queerness
Yeah.
does not have very specific language. I
Hmm.
think it's a thing that we can think about.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm sharing it.
No, that's helpful.
And another like question that I had was when we're talking about blase categories, and you're saying that it's not like mostly not categories which are recognized, and in terms of gender queer people, now there are legal categories of being transgender, for example.
But I don't think trans categories are what I'm thinking of. Like I'm thinking of genderqueer persons who don't want to identify as trans cis categories, right? Like because there are I'm thinking of people who want to reject gender as like a binary category. So there are trans binary categories, which is not the point I'm thinking of, but and also it is in the US context where like trans laws are incredibly state specific, and there isn't so the X marker has been the largest way of like recognizing in a legal contractual form within the administrative state a non-trans category. So it's like it's trying to think of like people whose identities are in flux and not within the binary. So I think there are trans non-binary people, there are lots of trans non-binary people, but it's much more um, people who identify as non-binary, whether or not transness is also part of their identity. You had your hand up, but I missed you.
Yeah. So I just wanted to share like a slightly different example from my own experience. So I had a friend in school, and when we were talking about Blase and all of this, it reminded me of how a couple of times, because of her physical features, people used to call her Chini or Chowmin or all of that to comment on the fact that she has narrower eyes or other features that make her look
Like
not
the first is sugar.
no, Chinese.
Chinese.
Oh, that's
Chinese.
the Hindi for
Chinky,
Chinky slang.
yeah.
Yeah, all of that. And I remember I was there a couple of times, and mind you, this wasn't kids saying this in like fifth grade or something. People used to say it like right up to 11th grade and all of that. And then sometimes she would just laugh it off, and sometimes you'd be like, oh, you know what, her name is actually so and so Kumar, so how can it be that she's Chinese or whatever? So you're trying to justify
The fact that
okay, I also belong. So I don't know, maybe there is some sort of partial sort of intentionality in it, because that you're
right.
calling someone as not, I don't know, Indian or whatever it is. But do you realize the gravity of your action, in the sense that it's snapping away at someone's sense of belongingness?
Yeah.
And building that reflex inside someone that they constantly have to justify myself, that okay, my
Right.
name is Ayana Kumar, so I'm a Kumar, so I can't be Chinese, so don't call me that. But yeah, I was just wondering if that also is something, because it's not like, I don't know if it fits easily into the categories.
Well, I think in this case it's a clear, yeah, it's like active. I mean, I would say it's like a this is the other reason why like comparative understandings of this is so interesting, right? If those words were used in an American context, it would be a classic, like it would be a discrimination suit. It would be clear violation of what was done. Like it would not even be questioned. I think it's because those terms have been um, it would not be a microaggression, it would be discrimination, right? Like even though the person doesn't have a sense of power over the other person, it would be seen as harassment, or like something to that. It would be it would be a clear legal category. And I think that's because those words in that context have been seen as hate speech and harmful acts, and seen as having intentionality to do harm. I think the example you're offering is interesting, because I noticed that a lot of you didn't flinch when those words were used, right? Because you've all heard it. It's become normalized as a thing that gets used, even if you yourself won't use it or don't want to use it or think it's wrong to use. And that's interesting to me, because then what it's really saying is the social category is still in flux. So maybe it's seen as somewhat harmful, and the other product that it does is that makes the person seem too sensitive. So if they have a problem with it, it's like, oh, you're taking this too seriously. I was joking.
Which is why she used to laugh it off. And she had a younger sister who was like in 4th or 5th grade. And she used to hear the same things, are you Japanese or whatever stuff, similar stuff. And they always used to laugh it off.
And I think the difference here is that it is an ethnic like it is a category based on a clear legal understanding of origin, right? Like so it's not race in the same way, but because race doesn't work in the same way across contexts, but it is about origin, and it is harassment. Even if it doesn't get reported, even if it doesn't get actually done, I think they might be blasé about making fun, because they're like, "Arey, don't." It's the same as the example that we had yesterday about calling someone, or even your example of like, saying, "Oh, you're so radical, you must be a terrorist," right? These words are, you could laugh it off, and you're like, you're so away from understanding anything useful that I'm not even going to engage with you, right? Or you could say, well, it makes me feel bad, but like I'm going to not make a big deal out of it. all of this, I would argue, is self-blase mechanisms where you're diminishing the harm because you know that it's not worth the hassle of contenting with it. But I don't know if it's blase simply because those underlying categories are categories of discrimination in some sort of social or legal way.
That's what I was wondering, because in the Indian context, so I don't know if it was in the blase reading itself or not, but somewhere I came across this term of a worthwhile form of discrimination.
Yeah.
So in the Indian
Yeah.
context,
Yeah.
in the kind of school that I grew up in, I don't know if I were to say that you put this sort of an action in the category
Yeah.
of discrimination based on religion, people would laugh at me.
Right.
They would say you're making a mountain out of a molehill.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And even when those settled categories do exist, what kind of gravity do we require
Yeah.
for an act to go there? And do these categories
Totally. When does it rise to the form of discrimination and when is it a microaggression? And I think in this case, it would be a microaggression because the category is settled, but it's not big enough for it to be seen as aggression. Right? So I would say it is aggression, right? But you're right. People who are likely to do administrative violence or administrative analysis of whether something is real or not are not likely to are not likely to deem it as actually that bad of a category. And I think that's the sort of that's what's at stake there. There's so many hands up. Like, why don't you start? Yeah.
So, when you're speaking about intention, what I thought of were what about cases where there is no intention per se, but it's just that usage has been established through a very defined structure. So, for example, coming from a law background, when we do moot courts, right? First of all, the first line you're supposed to say is, "Can I refer to the bench collectively as whatever your ladyship or your lordship?" First of all, there's only your lordship and ladyship. We don't use your honor in moot courts. But even then, it is a rule that if there are 5 male judges, you say your lordships. 5 female judges, you say your ladyships. But even if there is a single male judge, the bench collectively becomes your lordships. But this is not really. I don't think this has any correspondence with intention because time and again, year over year, it is reproduced as a law of the moot court. So is this blase? Because I mean, it's being.
It is if one of the people sitting on that bench are like, I don't want this, and says some. So blase is the response when someone says, I am being harmed, and you're like, eh. That's what I'm thinking of as blase. So there has to be a contestation. So it's like if one of the, I guess the moot court is it's a hard example because there's power. So what student is going to say no? Like, if you're there, nobody is going to say something because they're the judge, right? If I was on a moot court bench and you were saying lordships, first of all, I don't have a problem with the male pronoun, right? Like, but if I did have someone, if I was trying to say it on behalf of another person that was on there that I knew was struggling, I'm not going to take away 3 minutes of like a student's time and like disorient them before they start their vocal arguments. Like that would actually be me abusing power to feel settled in that minute to destabilize someone with less power than me in that context.
I am talking more towards the point when you're being taught that skill, right? So the fact that you need to call them your lordships collectively is being taught to you in your moot court clinic.
Correct. But when you're in the moot court clinic challenging that, if there was a non-binary person in your moot court clinic and they challenged it and the professor said, "Arey, ye to nahi hai," like this is not a real thing. And if they diminished how big, like, you said, you're making a mountain or a molehill, this is not a big thing. To me, that's blase. Because it means that this person does, because I think the question is whether when challenged, does the person respond to it in an affirming way or a dismissal way? That's when blase comes up. So blase is not just in the abstract, right? Yesterday when we were drawing those circles, you're going to identify in 10 different ways. Other people are going to read you in 10 different ways. That's all it is. The question is, if I ask you and I say, Sahil, I'd really like to be called Bala, right? And you're like, no, I'm going to call you Shwe. And you're like, that, and I'm like, actually, that is blase if you think that's not a problem, right? Like, so the question is whether if I'm asking you something after having told you my identity, you think it's not important enough to affirm. That is what blase is. So it's not, so I guess in your example, it would be what happens before you even go to that moot court, right? Not in front of the judge, because then it wouldn't be blase. It would be someone with power destabilizing you. But it would be if you went to your clinic teacher and say, hey, I'd really like us to rethink how we're using this. I know it's convention, but like it's not doing X or Y. And if they said, like, really, and they dismissed it. To me, that's blase.
वैसे judges ही नहीं आते That's usually the response you get. Like you're asking about how do
How to
I
do-
respectfully this thing. It's not going to be a problem because you're not going to have a.
But why is
judgment.
that a hard thing? It's so easy to
Just
change
call
to
people
like
judge.
yeah, your
It's
honorable
not
judges
like
or
an
your
art.
honor. There are so many different gender neutral ways to do this. It's like fascinating that they still think that that's
They
necessary.
explicitly told not to use anything other than
Yeah. You had your hand up.
So I wanted to understand when so we were discussing food choices.
Food.
Yeah. How vegetarianism and so the person
Veganism
who
is the other thing that I
yeah,
have
so
to
the
this.
person who is actually like doing this blase discrimination thinks that their intention is something else. Like hygiene, it's not related to like category per se.
But it is casteist.
But it is casteist and it can be a communal thing also. So like where does it fit in this category of microaggression and blase discrimination?
Are they doing it thinking they're doing it for reasons of hygiene, or is that the
I mean
smoke
that is what they think it is.
Yeah.
Cool.
Really, but the question is whether if someone says, I want to use this, and then they're like, no, I don't want to do it because of hygiene. Is that the example you're giving? So you're saying you're sharing a plate, and then someone says, no, I don't do, which is like,
It's not because of your caste or it's not because of your religion, but
They
it
have
is
this idea of purity in their mind.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's
That
like-
is not hygiene. That has never been hygiene. That
all
is
of hygiene is purity too, though, right? Like this idea of like this should be really clean. It should be washed in the next. Like a lot of those social scripts that get the smoke screen of hygiene also gets used to do the same thing that you're going to do. But just to answer your question, I think if someone said, I don't want to share it, and if the other person felt bad about it and said, and questioned them about, I guess it's not an identity. I think that's why I'm struggling to figure out what this would be. Is it like it's not affirming an identity, right? In that case, because it's not, because your identity is not being primed to be affirmed or not affirmed. What's at stake is whether there's a interactional discrimination. So it feels a little bit different, but I would say it's not blasé because I don't think anything is actually truly about the reason they offer. I think there's intention there.
But it is identity also, no? Matlab, it's literally the cornerstone of untouchability.
Right, but that's why I think it's not blasé. It can't be blasé.
That I agree, but
Yeah.
it is identity.
I don't. But the question is whether the identity is being primed in asking for it. I guess that's what I'm having trouble saying.
Can it be blase for the other person? Yeah. I have the same person.
Oh, the other person, matlab,
The person who is doing that discrimination.
it is always, that's what blase is. Blase is by the person who's doing it, right? And it's whether it's being received by someone as actually, because I would argue that blase is always received as violent by the person for whom it's being done. So the person who shuts the store at someone's face, irrespective of their intention, is always seen as it is likely to always be seen as violent by the person for whom it is being done. But blase is whether the act, the perpetrator thinks of it, ever thinks of it again. And so I think in this case, it's not blasé. It actually is.
Add it in blase, but
Yeah.
Discrimination.
So what happens when it's like, so I am a vegetarian and I think all my friends are non-vegetarian.
Respond to it.
But it's like, I don't know. I'm sure like non-vegetarians imposing sort of their diet on and their preferences on me is no way casteist in that sense because there's no purity angle anymore.
There isn't purity about vegetarianism.
No, that I am being judged for being a vegetarian. So I was part of a mood team where 5 people. It was 6 people team. 5 of them were non-vegetarian, and I'm a vegetarian. And we traveled to Hong Kong, which is basically like seafood.
My God.
Not a lot of vegetarian food at all. And often it would be like, okay, the, I had to like hunt for food, like legitimately I had to hunt for food. Lot of days I was just on like fruits and stuff. But it was like whenever we'd go out, there was no accommodation for me in the sense that um, there would be particular this thing. Okay, we have to find food that we like, and she can deal. with
She can figure it out.
Yeah, she can figure it out. And whenever we'd go out as a team collectively, like the jokes would just not stop. And at
Because
one,
you were vegetarian.
yeah, because I'm a vegetarian, and I would lose my mind. I'm not eating real food. I'm not getting any nutrition.
Very bad humor.
This-
Just saying.
Yeah, this is like this
Yeah.
just sounds like bad mood court team. I feel like the takeaway here is that this is not blasé because there seems to be intention. There seems to be intention to be just like terrible colleagues.
Yeah.
But
But but it's not just in that mood team ka context. This is something like I've felt.
but saying that you're vegetarian is hard. I don't know. I feel like India is one of the few places where you can say you're vegetarian and not have it be hard.
Ha, that's true.
Right? I think the vegetarianism conversation just flips on its head depending on where you are, and it's yeah, because there are so many options here, and because there's actually way more stereotypes attached to people, for example, who eat organ meat, right? Like than people who are vegetarian. There is an association of purity to vegetarianism, even if you yourself don't attach it to it. That comes from something as dirty, right? Like as meat or cultures of butchery in this country as unsanitary, which again gets used by people that are not from here that think about, oh, I'm going to be vegetarian in India because it's unsafe to eat meat in India, right? Like there's these other global blases as well. But I don't know if like in this, because of the context, I think in your Hong Kong example, it totally makes sense that would be it would be hard
But
to
then
find.
even here, like some of my friends have literally told me like, okay, we're just going to force feed you. But
That sounds like people force feeding alcohol on people because they're like, I want to
yeah,
remind.
alcohol is another thing because I don't drink, and then that's like a similar.
Yeah, this just sounds like bad. I don't know what to say. I feel like this is not a political comedy. Like this is really. I think you should do self-reflection, no matter what Kranti says, right? I think you should do self-reflection and really think about whether these are people you want to hang out with. Like this sounds like actual torture. Like why are people forcing you to eat and do things? This sounds wrong.
Get better friends. Not being about being vegetarian, just think about as being lactose intolerant. So, in an Indian subcontinent, even you go outside of India, there are a lot of places you don't have any option. If you are lactose intolerant, you can
As a lactose intolerant person, I can attest to
Not
this.
like people are just looking at that. You are able to eat this,
Yeah.
and you'll be like, oh, yeah, but there is no like I'm not having some kind of discrimination with somebody, but yeah, I cannot eat it actively. It will be harming me in a sense or another sense.
But I actually think allergens are. I'm glad you brought up food. So allergens for me is another way to think about blaseness, right? So when people said I have an allergy 20 years ago, they'd be like, oh, this is just you being fancy, right? Like they wouldn't believe it. Someone would have to actually go into shock for someone to believe that this is a real thing. And I think lactose intolerance is a useful example because it's not as bad that you will die. Although I come close to death, but like there's like a assumption that this is like it's a preference. Like you don't really like milk. It's just you're trying not to drink something, whatever. It's seen as a preference. Like during field work, I had to drink chai every day, right? Because it would be offered. It would be rude to not take it. It was really hard. Yeah, that's fair. But I think food preferences in that way are a helpful reminder of the kinds of blasé that happens seamlessly. I've seen.
Professor, I had a question with respect to the concept of classy, but and also an example, but I'll ask that after the question. So could you please explain the interaction of legal categories and power with classy?
Or social in terms of social and legal categories, or
Social and legal.
so I think the legal categories are what you can actually contest if it got to a high enough level. So if you think of it as like a container and like like there's 10 milliliters requires discrimination, 2 milliliters is microaggression, right? But there's at least a container for you to pour something in because it's a legal category. My argument is that this is when it's not even a legal category, or whether the understanding of whether it's even in that category. Like, I think lactose intolerance is a great example too, right? Like, it's not in that legal category, but it still causes harm, and whether the dismissal of that harm is relevant.
There's no jar in which
So
to pour.
there's no jar to pour.
And
Like,
where does social category?
so social category completely depends on your environment. So it's like, is it in this class? Okay, that's like I thought you were putting your hand up. You got tired, so you stood up fully. I was like, I will fight, matlab. I'm like, so the social categories for me are slightly more in flux, right? So it's like, what is the environment you're in? What is the state you're in? What are the friends you have? Matlab, Vaishnavi's friends like definitely are like committed to blasiness, right? But it's like what are the kinds of exchanges you have within a given category? And it's a much more interactional, communal understanding of what the category is, as opposed to a legal category.
And where does power come in?
Power is always omnipresent in all of it. But if there is no legal category, then the power doesn't matter because you can't enforce it within a category. But in a social category, you can. Like, if I'm a professor and I say, these are my pronouns, right? Like, even people who don't believe that this is what should be will choose not to say my pronouns at all. They might not use my pronouns, but they will know not to say my pronouns at all, right? So the social category can get navigated with power differently than a legal category. So them using my pronouns wrong, for example, I can't take them to the ombudsman and say this is a discrimination that's a kind of discrimination.
And the actor, do they necessarily have to not realize that they're doing the harm for it to be a blase?
That they have to, the intention question, yeah, they have to. Well, actually, I'm not committed to it. I think even if you realize it but you don't care that it's big enough to actually engage with it, then it's blase.
But that's where I think I get a bit. I know you said that you're not working very hard at distinguishing microaggression from thing.
Because I think it incapacitates. I think something can be a microaggression and non-blase, and a microaggression and blase.
Right. But like, I keep to also sort of the point that this one was making about racist language and how normalized it is. Is there a point at which categories cease to be categories even though they are, say, legally recognized? So race, ethnicity, religion, etc., legally recognized categories. And however, if you've gotten to a place, because you say the person doesn't, if I call you out on doing something to me and you don't lose any sleep over
Exactly.
it is an irrelevant thing.
Yeah.
You're like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. Actually, that is literally blase. Can you record that? With my book, I'll have a website of people respond. Exactly, QR code. It's like, listen to what blase sounds like.
Right. But the thing is that you can be, what are you talking about very clear legal categories if it is socially acceptable.
Totally.
Which is why the example of calling somebody chinky or literally looking at Muslims anytime any kind of violence happens. In a way that doesn't attach to Hindus when or to white male Christians.
Why are you? This is pointed. You're not highly. Exactly. I'm trying to assure you that I'm not a white male Christian.
I am assured. No, that was just my hand. But the number of say shootings that with, say,
totally.
But the point that I'm making is
that young white men who are incels, like there's like an assumption about celibacy also that gets attached to it, and
so I guess what I'm trying to say is that you can have legal categories and you can make legal categories not matter by sort of
by being blase. And I think the thing, you're right, blaseness could be at a legal, a non-legal, and a non-social, and a legal and a social category. But if it's with a legal category, you have some patta, like you can actually use something and say, this was not high enough for it to be done, but I can still register it as a problem. It might not be worth my effort, I might not do it, but I can still do it in a parallel universe where I want to. In a flux category where it's only socially, where there's some social recognition but not really full social recognition, I can't take it. So then it's a microaggression. And then the question is whether you're blasé about it or not.
I guess I'm thinking about it in the Indian context where we don't really have harassment law,
Yeah, that's true.
right? And so if you don't, you can't actually do it.
Yeah. Yes, your example.
Yeah, so this is exactly what I was going to ask. The example was with respect to a legal category being there. So I read about a case where a person called another person who belonged to a lower category within the SC/ST Act a particular name, which was the name of their caste, which is an offense in the SC/ST Act. Now the other person took it to court, even though the accused claimed that they said it in the spur of a moment, it was not intended with a discriminative mindset. And the court actually upheld the same view. They said that if the intention is not there, then you can't enforce the provision, even though it goes against the legislature's intention of making that provision. So I had this question with respect to the Blase that you were referring to, that even when, just what the professor spoke, that even when there is a legal category
Yeah.
present, if
the social acceptance of it is different.
yeah, would it still count as a Blase? Or
I think it's not blasé. I think this is classically brutal. This is like classic discrimination that the courts are based on fact not approving to be discrimination, but it doesn't make the discrimination go away, in my opinion, right? Like, I don't think only legally attested or ascribed discrimination is discrimination. I think you can still have those, as we know.
How are we going to measure the intention or something? There is
You
nothing
can't.
to do.
Exactly. So the reason is it's whether there was a legal category where it doesn't hit the limit of what can be seen one way or the other, or whether it's not even a legal category. And I think another thing is how the judge can only say that because they know that the social the possibility of a social uprising from it is unlikely to actually change judicial precedent going forward, right? Like, there's also this, they're trying to set precedent for future rulings to make sure that there are limits to that legal category that can get enforced. So that's interesting. You get last word because you've had your hand up 3 times.
Multiple thoughts because again, I've had it for a while. One, I want to question like a fellow artist. One of my friends, Adnan Sheikh, has a Zain out. What do you call? How do you what do you call queer in your language? Where,
cool.
it's a conversation that they had with their mother about primarily Hindi, from what I remember, and it was worldwide. But then the mom referred to gay people as people with that problem, literally transcribed. And there was this back and forth of we don't have a problem. That's not what we are. And but then the mom had no other way to phrase it in Hindi because she doesn't have
this came on
the
queer
vernacular
beat.
in English to
Yeah.
say that. So that is one interesting way to look at language. Secondly, I have specifically with the lactose intolerant example, I have a blase example I can give you. So I'm half Tamil, and a lot of my cousins are lactose intolerant, and something that
It's not a Tamilian thing, just the generalizability is not that all Tamilians are lactose intolerant.
But there is
research
in the
Yeah.
literally the places that raise cows drink a lot more milk, have developed genes. There is entire Europe, northern India. There is research on that. So you could generalize a little bit.
I guess Tamilians are great in other ways. We can't drink milk.
No, but I don't know. So one thing, not is like, Tamilians have like a lot of curd rice, and then like, if you're lactose intolerant, you can't even have curd rice. Can you even call yourself Tamil? So then there's again, I would say that is blase, right? Because you are taking away their belongingness, but you're enveloping it in a joke, and you don't, because again, it is family members, you don't intend to harm them very much.
Okay, family members harm people all the time.
Yeah.
Like, this is like we do not have to give them an out. Like, harm can come from friend circles, family members, and we put all of this on the table today.
Yeah, no, in this specific example, when this happened, like, it wasn't. It was
Yeah,
just like
it was like it was like a
it was meant to be a joke, but it's just like, isn't this can very well be blase.
if it hurts the person, and if the person says don't do it, and they continue to
chipping
do
away
it.
at their belongingness
Right, but I think blase for me is not just like the first act. It's whether someone says, "Don't say that. That makes me feel bad about how I belong," and then the person continues to say it because they don't think it's important enough to change. So it's not the first act. I mean, people say rubbish things all the time, right? Like that's like the starting point. It's whether you say a rubbish thing, I say, "Hey, that actually hurt me," and that's why the disrespect is helpful, right? It's like whether if I say something hurt me, your response to that is still um, doesn't change because you don't think the thing that I said is even important enough to worry
Hurt is
about.
not valid.
Hurt is not valid. Hurt is not important enough to even register. Um, as someone that was told I'm not Tamil for hating Thai Southern my entire life, like this is like it's. But I never thought it took away from my Tamil identity. Yeah. Last word. I clearly have extended.
Last words.
Yeah.
Yeah, so sorry to be circling back to this, but I just feel like this problem of where then do we place such acts which do have a certain amount of
Yeah.
intention behind them.
Yeah.
But they also correspond to some legal categories, but
Yeah.
they've been so very much internalized within us that we just don't associate them with a harm linked to a legal category, as Professor Mukherjee was saying. So one more thing, I feel like especially in Hindi, and I don't know, more so at least in Delhi, the kind of slurs or the kind of very frequently used abusive words.
Oh my
that
God,
you
they're
hear.
all feminine. Yeah.
Yeah, essentially you're
In every
continuously,
language, by
like,
the way.
anything. Yeah, so I'm
Yeah.
primarily a Hindi speaker, so I'm coming from that point. But every single abusive word in that sense, you're essentially talking about harassing a woman.
Yeah.
It is
Yeah.
essentially
Yeah.
that. And when I've a couple of times pointed that out in front of my friends, I've been called someone who's stuck up or who's too
Yeah.
rude or
Yeah.
can you just be a little cool? And then
And that's
that
blasé,
pushes
yeah.
me into a self-blase that
Totally,
maybe I'm just
totally.
stupid. I don't
Or
say
maybe
these
I'm just so I can't take a joke. Why can't I just be more
like, I
easygoing?
don't
Yeah.
use those words, but then I have to constantly reassure people that okay, I'm not that rigid. You can say those words in front of me. I won't say it and I won't support you, but you can say it. So
I think that's an example of blasé. Like I think that is
Yeah.
an excellent example of blasé,
yeah.
right?
So it's not like I'm different with you or I'm going to be judgy or anything of that sort for you for saying that.
But you are being judgy. You just don't want them to know you're being judgy because judgy is a bad thing that reinforces the fact that you are stuck up, which you don't want to be. Right? Like these are that's the
I'm not
thing.
judging you unfairly, right? It's
Exactly. So which is what being judgy is.
That's the point.
I'm supportive of your judginess. In this universe, judginess is a positive reinforcement mechanism.
So yeah, even though you can very clearly link it to gender,
Yeah.
if I told someone that you're doing something that can possibly be legally wrong,
Yeah.
they're going to laugh in my face.
Yeah.
And yeah, so
Yeah.
it's just that even if it does very clearly
Yeah.
correspond to a legal category in some contexts, and acutely so I feel in the Indian context, it's just so internalized, so socialized, just so very normal that
Yeah. That the person who
legal
questions it is the
category
one
being
that's
there
wrong.
doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Because no
Yeah.
one will ever it is a fight and a big struggle in itself for you to take that incident or those kinds of
Yeah.
habits to that legal category. Like that gap is just very, very hard
Yeah.
to bridge.
So that's a really good place to stop this at too. Like not just because we're 3 minutes over time, but because it's like a useful thing to mull about, which is like if the legal category is there but it's not accessible, is it even a legal category? Which is the question we're sort of asking, right? Like in terms of what the category is. I realized we didn't do spade and accidental feminism, which I think we can turn into what we're doing tomorrow, into the limits of gender. I might change the amount of reading so you have fewer things to read tomorrow because I want to work on your papers in small batches for a good chunk of time tomorrow, just because I'm going to leave tomorrow evening. So I want to make sure I have a chance to check in with all of you. Like Professor Mukherjee takes the last class of utopic gender. So I want to make sure I can check in with any of you that want to talk about your papers tomorrow. And so there'll be a bunch of like writing time allocated to work on your paper. I know I said I'll give you time to work on it today, but our conversation was so rich, I didn't get a chance to do that. So you've taken a break. Those of you that have joined us, like work on your papers to get it to a point where we can work on it starting tomorrow, and we can talk to you as well after class. But thank you all for this really generative, vulnerable discussion. This is great. Thank you.